Joe Arridy was born in Pueblo, Colorado on April 29th of 1915 to Henry and Mary Arridy. His parents were Syrian immigrants who came to the United States in 1909. Joe's father worked for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Works, and they all lived in a small house owned by the company. During the first few years of his life, Joe was an only child, and although he was physically well, he had mental problems. Joe's mental condition was not apparent until he entered the first grade and was not able to keep up with other children. When he started the second grade, the principal asked his parents to keep him home. For the next 3 years, Joe stayed at home, playing and wandering as children do. Joe was not well supervised, and even though he was quiet and resigned, he spent much of his time wandering around the town of Pueblo. Not able to really control him and having to look after his brother and sister, Joe's father became frustrated and unsure what to do. Seeking advice from the neighbors, who all had a general disdain for Joe, they told his father to have him committed. Henry went before the Pueblo District Court and had Joe committed to the Colorado State Home and Training School for mental deficits at Grand Junction. This was more or less an insane asylum. The judge agreed and Joe was sent to the home. While at the asylum, the professionals there tested Joe and determined that his IQ was only 46. He had the mind of a 6-year-old. 9 months later, Henry began to miss his son and have second thoughts about sending him to the center, so he successfully petitioned a judge to have Joe released. Joe returned home, but again was not well supervised and continued to float around the city of Pueblo. In September of 1929, Joe, now 14, was cornered by a group of older African American boys and forced to commit sexual acts on them. A probation officer happened to pass by during this incident and caught the boys. The officer saved Joe from the situation and commenced to write a letter to the state home Joe was previously in. The letter stated, "I picked him up this morning for allowing some of the nastiest and dirtiest things done to him that I have ever heard of. The boy must be returned." The people of the neighborhood are neglectful as they are afraid of the boy and think he should never have been turned loose. The letter did not mention much of the older boys, though there was a separate letter written to the local law enforcement about them, but it's unknown whether much came of it. Joe was taken back to the asylum and put in a special ward for sexual deviants, where staff were trained to watch for and stop perverse activity, in particular the act of masturbation. During Joe's entire time in the ward, there was never a single incident in his file about sexual activity. Next to the asylum were active Union Pacific Railroad tracks, and it was not uncommon for patients to escape by train. On August 9th of 1936, Joe, along with 3 others, hopped a train headed for Pueblo. Once they arrived in town, Joe wandered around the train yard, while the others went to town. When the 3 returned, they found Joe and hopped another train back to Grand Junction. On August 12th, the 3 men gave up their flight, but not Joe. It remains unknown where he was for the next 8 days, as he did not remember and no one reported seeing him. He turned up in the rail yards of Cheyenne, Wyoming. There, Joe found Mr. and Mrs. Glenn Gibson, who were in charge of a kitchen car, and told them he could work for food. Joe started washing dishes for them, and for the next several days he would remain there. Not long after, he was arrested by railroad detectives and transferred to County Sheriff George E. Carroll. Sheriff Carroll was a highly experienced lawman who was loved by the press. He was persuasive and knew how to work people, part of the reason why the media adored him. Plus, his experience made him a trusted figure. That's why Carroll's interest was piqued when he asked Joe where he was from, and he responded, "Pueblo." A major story was breaking in Joe's hometown. A week before he hopped the train at Grand Junction on August 2nd of 1936, Mrs. R.O. McMurtry, 58, and her aunt, Sally Crumpley, 72, were sleeping in their home in Pueblo when someone broke in. The two were viciously attacked with a hammer. Mrs. McMurtry survived the encounter. 13 days later, on August 15th, only 3 blocks away from the first crime, Dorothy Drain, 15, and her sister, Barbara, 12, were attacked in a similar manner. Roughly the same time of night as the previous attack, the two were sleeping while their parents attended a charity dance. The intruder entered the home and attacked both with a hatchet, then raped Dorothy. Dorothy died during the attack when the hatchet entered her brain. Her sister Barbara survived, but was left in a coma. The police believed the crimes were related since they shared many similarities, and a $1,000 reward was put up for the capture of the perpetrator. Known and suspected sex criminals from all over the Southwest were rounded up and questioned. Officials took the crime so seriously that a man who escaped the Pueblo State Hospital was shot to death while resisting arrest. Now, Joe was from Pueblo, escaped an insane asylum, and supposedly had a record of perverse sexual behavior. Just an hour and a half after he started questioning Joe, Carol called Chief Arthur Grady in Pueblo and told him, "We are holding a fellow here who says he killed the little Drain girl in your city." Chief Grady was surprised upon hearing this, later recounting that he almost dropped the phone when Carol first told him, since he already thought he already had the perpetrator. For the past 6 days, Grady had been holding a man named Frank Aguilar and was trying to coax a confession out of him. Aguilar was a 35-year-old Mexican native who had been hired and fired by Arridy Drain, the two girls' father. Aguilar was a suspect since he had showed up to Dorothy Drain's funeral despite being fired and was acting suspicious during the service. Not bothering with a warrant, the police searched Aguilar's home and found a hatchet with nicks in it that the coroner believed matched the cuts in Dorothy Drain's head. Grady had evidence but no confession, while Carol had a confession with no evidence. Carol convinced Grady that Joe was who they were looking for, so Pueblo County District Attorney French Taylor and 2 detectives traveled to Cheyenne to pick up Arridy. The news of Joe was spread all over. Carol even told the paper that Joe committed the act just for meanness. Carol gave the papers a detailed account of how he made Joe confess, playing on the sexual deviant theme he told them. Carol likely embellished much of his story, but it is not known by how much since, again, there is no official documentation of the interrogation. Joe even admitted to the 2 other crimes that would have been impossible for him to commit, since he was still in the asylum when they occurred. Aguilar finally confessed. Unlike Joe's confession, that was only taken by Sheriff Carell, Frank's was taken down by an actual court reporter. Frank admitted that on the night of the rape and murder, he overheard that Arridy Drain and his wife would not be home the next evening. He went to their house and watched them leave before entering their home and committing the crime. Frank's story went that he met Joe by chance and found out that Joe was a sexual deviant. Frank told Joe about the crime he was planning to commit, and Joe agreed to go along with it. They sat hidden outside the Drain's house and watched Mr. and Mrs. Drain to leave. After the couple left, they waited 10 to 15 minutes for the children to fall asleep. They broke into the home, found the girls' bedroom, and hit Dorothy several times with the hatchet before Frank started to rape her. In the middle of raping Dorothy, Barbara woke up and yelled at them to get out. Frank hit Barbara with the blunt end of the hatchet, knocking her out. He continued with Dorothy, and once he was done, Joe raped her. Once Joe was done, Frank hit Dorothy again with the hatchet, though she was likely already dead, and they left the house. They split up and never saw each other after. Of course, Joe, being his agreeable self, he confirmed the story. On December 15th of 1936, 4 months to the day of the murder, Frank Aguilar was brought to trial for rape, assault, and the murder of Barbara and Dorothy Drain. He was also charged with the assault and murder of Mrs. R.O. McMurtry and Sally Crumpley. The star of the trial was Barbara, Dorothy's little sister, who testified against Frank. She had fully recovered after spending 2 weeks in a coma and retained her memory of the night. Barbara said she woke up and saw the face of a strange man in their room. D.A. Taylor asked if she said anything to him, to which she stated, "I told him to get out." Taylor then asked if the man she saw was in the courtroom. She said yes, and was then asked to identify the man. Barbara stood up, walked across the courtroom, stopped in front of Frank, and pointed at him. D.A. Taylor rested the prosecution's case after this. That night, Frank admitted to his lawyer that he did commit the murder. Frank was sentenced to death by gas chamber. Throughout Frank's short trial, no one brought up Joe, and Barbara never said or was asked about the second man. At D.A. Taylor's request, Joe was examined by 3 state psychiatrists who all came to the conclusion that Joe, incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong, therefore would be unable to perform any action with criminal intent. Their findings were almost word for word the legal definition of insanity. All 3 psychiatrists testified and told the court how they came to their conclusion. The most interesting part of the trial was when Joe himself testified. Bernard asked Joe 22 simple questions to show that Joe was not sane and did not think the same as others. Bernard asked, "Do you know what an oath is?" Joe answered, "No." "Who is Franklin Roosevelt?" No answer. "Do you know what the hearing is about?" No. "Can you write?" "Sure." "Can you write anything besides your name?" No. The questions were all similar to this, and Joe did not know the answer or understand most of them. Cross-examined Joe and tried to ask questions that showed that Joe knew his bearings and what was going on around him. Also, trying to touch on Joe's supposed perverse fantasies. Ralph: "Where are you going tonight, Joe?" Joe: "Back to Grand Junction." Ralph: "Why are you going back to Grand Junction?" Joe: "I like the place." Ralph: "You want to do what you like to do, don't you, Joe?" Joe: "Yes." Ralph: "Do you like girls?" Joe: "Pretty good." Smiles. After Joe left the stand, Ralph called up 4 lawmen, one of them being Sheriff George Carroll. Unsurprisingly, Carroll's testimony overshadowed everyone else's as he explained his experience with criminals and how he could tell that Joe understood right from wrong. After this testimony, the jury deliberated and found Joe to be legally sane, therefore able to be tried for murder. After this, the jury left and returned after deliberating for 3.5 hours. They said that Joe was sane and found him guilty of rape and murder. He was sentenced to death by gas chamber. The next day, the paper reported that Joe took no notice of the pronouncement of the death verdict as delivered by the jury foreman. The paper reported that the $1,000 reward offered in the Drain case had been awarded to Sheriff Carroll and the railroad detectives who turned Joe over. Warden Best helped Joe greatly and even hired an attorney for him. Best was a tough but fair man. He believed in capital and corporal punishment, but he was also caring and took pity on Arridy, seeing that Joe was not what the police and press made him out to be. Joe spent 1.5 years on death row, and it was a joyful time for him. He spent much of it playing and entertaining himself with the never-ending endurance of a child. He would polish his metal food plate and use it as a mirror to talk to himself and make funny faces that he would laugh at. Warden Best gave him children's books gave him children's picture books that contained funny faces. Joe laughed at them until they fell apart. Best gave Joe scissors when this happened so he would cut faces out, and he did so while humming peacefully. However, Joe didn't like anything more than the bright red wind-up car with battery-powered headlights and the toy train. Joe would scoot the car around his cell, and if he smashed it into something or tipped it over, he would shout, "Car wreck, car wreck." He would run the train up and down the hallway between the death row cells. Other inmates in his block, all confessed killers, were patient with Joe and would catch his train when he rolled it in their way. "I want to live here with Warden Best," Joe told one of the reporters in December of 1938. "Don't you want to go back to the home in Grand Junction?" the reporter asked. "No, I want to get a life sentence and stay here with Warden Best. At the home, the kids used to beat me. I never get in trouble here." A Kansas City reporter wrote that Joe was unaware of the building tension. He sat in his cell making faces in his polished dinner plate, stating that he cannot comprehend that the state wants to take his life. On January 5th of 1939, Best asked Joe what he would like for his last meal, to which he replied, "Ice cream." That evening, Best brought Joe a box of cigars and a mountain of homemade candy. He ate so much that his stomach became upset, and he gave the rest of it away to other inmates. The next day was his last, and he started it with a short visit from his mother and other family members. His father had died 11 months earlier. When visiting with his mother, she collapsed in tears, but Joe didn't seem to understand and returned to his cell. He spent the rest of the day smoking cigars, eating ice cream, and playing with his beloved train. As he was walked to the gas chamber, Joe stopped to give his train to one of the other inmates. As he did this, he talked about how he would soon be raising chickens and playing the harp. Warden Best proclaimed that Joe was the happiest man on death row. On January 6, 1939, Joe Arridy was sent to the gas chamber and murdered for a crime he did not commit. The next day, the Daily News headlines read, "23-year-old child dies for slaying," and reported that he walked to his death with the faith of a child and grinned as he was strapped into the death chair.